With that in mind, we should not forget that America's development began with a large-scale ethnic cleansing, unprecedented in human history. I wouldn't like to delve so deeply into it, but you're forcing me to do it. When Europeans arrived in America, that was the first thing they did. And you have to be honest about it. There are not so many stories like that in human history. Take the destruction of Carthage by the Roman Empire. The legend has it that Romans ploughed over and sowed the city with salt so that nothing will ever grow there. Europeans didn't use the salt because they used the land for agriculture, but they wiped out the indigenous population. Then there was slavery, and that's something that's deeply ingrained in America. In his memoirs, US Secretary of State Colin Powell revealed how hard it was for him as a black man, how hard it was for him to live with other people staring at you. It means this mentality has taken root in the hearts and minds of the people, and is likely to still be there.
In doing this, every negative thing one could possibly say about America was dredged up, circulated in books, movies, TV, schools, colleges, and even the clergy, so that the youth would be endlessly indoctrinated. Things like white men killed the Indians, fathers were repressive, God is dead, the founders had slaves.
In this episode of Putin's Marxists, we're going to investigate Benjamin Norton. He works with RT, Russian state-owned media. He also runs the website Grey Zone, which is entirely devoted to pushing Kremlin propaganda. In the book titled Love Letter to America, KGB defector Yuri Bezmenov wrote that the Soviets would destroy the US from within, using what's known as cultural Marxism. And one of their main methods of demoralizing the American education system is to infiltrate schools and universities with radicals and leftists, who are often functioning unknowingly under the direct guidance of KGB agents of influence.
And let's actually talk about that. Trump says he wants to make America great again. Of course, the question is, when was America great? Professor Horn underscored this perfectly, better than anyone else can, that this is a country, it's a settler colony founded on one of the most massive genocides in human history, then in which hundreds of thousands and millions of people were brought as slaves, and subsequent generations were enslaved and lived under a system of racial apartheid until the 1960s. Not just to mention slavery and Jim Crow, but also the ongoing genocide of indigenous peoples. There still are indigenous peoples in this country. We see with pipelines, we see with cantonment. I mean, they're still grossly oppressed and colonized by this country.
Ben, a Kremlin propagandist, is pushing cultural Marxism for Americans exactly as Putin does. Putin is former KGB. In 1984, KGB defector Bezmenov wrote that this was their strategy for the US, and today we see it coming to fruition. Yes, colonialism is horrific for the losing side, but that was hundreds of years ago. There's nothing you can do to change that. And slavery has been abolished, but the KGB does not want Americans living in peace. They want you to continue fighting just as you were doing in the past. Human history is one group of people killing and exploiting another group of people. Putin is a sick hypocrite. His establishment in Russia is guilty of genocide as well, but him and his operatives like Ben will focus on past atrocities of Western countries in order to incite the masses to fight each other, thus destabilizing your enemy country from within. In this video, American children are tearing down their own flag thanks to an education system infiltrated by Marxists. This is exactly what Bezmenov warned us about. To further prove my point, Ben said that the British flag represents genocide, racism, and mass murder. But he doesn't actually care about people dying. He defends the Soviet Union's genocide of Ukrainians. He insults the memory of millions of Ukrainians who were starved to death by the Soviet Union and claims that it's all Nazi propaganda. The Holodomor was also covered by the American and British media. He denies the Holodomor just as RT does. And he works with RT, Putin's propaganda outlet. He also claimed that the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was a fascist lie. He's completely distorting reality. Regardless of what side you're on, It's a fact that the Soviet Union and Germany agreed to a non-aggression pact and both invaded Poland. An EU resolution stated that Stalin and Hitler shared guilt for World War II because of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Then Putin called it a shameless lie. Once again, Putin and Ben pushing the same propaganda. In Russia, Putin made it illegal to criticize the Soviet Union. Vladimir Luzgin was fined 200,000 rubles, which is over $3,000 US, for reposting an article on social media claiming that Germany and the Soviet Union both attacked Poland. So he shared his opinion on history and was convicted of falsifying history. Think about how insane that is.
Сволочь, свинья антисемитская. По-другому сказать нельзя. Он полностью солидаризировался с Гитлером в его антиеврейских, антисемитских настроениях и, более того, за издевательство над еврейским народом обещал поставить ему памятник в Варшаве. Именно такие люди, которые тогда вели переговоры с Гитлером, именно такого сорта люди сегодня сносят памятники воинам-освободителям, воинам Красной Армии, освободившим страны Европы.
After Putin said that the Bolsheviks liberated Europe, one of my fans said in the comment section, "I didn't realize the walls in eastern Berlin were built to keep the West Berliners from sneaking in." Here's Ben again pushing the same propaganda as Putin. He said that the communists in the Red Army liberated Berlin. I didn't know that raping 2 million females is considered liberation. Especially when some of the girls were as young as 8 years old.
Если вы узнали, что кто-то кого-то изнасиловал, то...
Да, никто на это не обращал внимания, наоборот, рассказывали солдаты друг другу, и, так сказать, это был такой импульс, так сказать, его геройства или доблести, или как так сказать. Что он там переспал с такой-то, понимаешь, женщиной, или одной, или двумя, или тремя. Вот так. Даже если кого-то там и убили, ну так мало ли что, это же война. А подумаешь, большое дело там, понимаешь, переспал солдат с какой-то женщиной там или девушкой.
Ben is constantly inciting Americans to remove Confederate monuments. Meanwhile, he condemns Ukrainians for removing statues of Vladimir Lenin. The US abolished slavery. The Soviet Union continued the practice of slavery. Nobel Peace Prize winning Russian historian Alexander Solzhenitsyn wrote about the millions of people who died in the Soviet Union's gulags and communist slave labor camps throughout Siberia, Ethiopia, Cuba, Vietnam, China, and Yugoslavia. Also, after Putin claimed that the Bolsheviks liberated Europe, Poland's deputy foreign minister, Paweł Jablonski, said that they did not liberate Warsaw, but brought in years of communist slavery. Clearly, Ben only brings up past atrocities of Western countries because he wants you to hate your own country. His job is to radicalize the left, just as Yuri Bezmenov explained. Communist Russia and China have killed at least 60 million people, but that's fine with him because revolution was achieved in those countries. The ultimate goal of the Soviet Union was always world revolution, and its second flag was a hammer and sickle over the entire world. What's left to conquer? Mainly the West, which is now being targeted with cultural Marxism and destroyed from within without a shot being fired. Ben also defends China's policy of imprisoning Uyghur Muslims in re-education camps. He often claims that it's all propaganda because the Western media covers it. Muslims all over the Middle East and Asia are covering this issue, so his excuse doesn't hold water. Yes, a certain group of people use the Western media to lie and promote the Iraq War. Now, so many Kremlin propagandists and alt media are claiming that anything coming out of the Western media is a lie, and only Russian state-sponsored media tells the truth. To this day, Putin and RT still lie about 9/11.
And what's interesting is with this recent story that Paul mentioned of 1,400 migrant children who have been separated from their families and are missing, which is an absolute crime. It should be taken before the International Criminal Court if the US actually recognized it. But what's interesting about this point is that on social media, there was a photo of these young children held in a privatized detention center that looks like a prison. It's effectively a privatized prison.
This scumbag supports China separating children from their families. Then he has the audacity to pretend that he cares about migrant children being separated from their families in the US. His hypocrisy is truly astounding. He's really the Kremlin's version of Ben Shapiro. Zionists claim that Israel has a right to annex Palestinian land because it used to be Jewish territory. Kremlin propagandists like Ben claim that Russia has a right to annex Crimea because it used to be Russian territory. Ben claims to be against Zionism, but he acts like an Israeli settler. He's always complaining about Western countries violating international law and sources the UN. Meanwhile, he supports Russia's annexation of Crimea, which the UN also admits is a violation of international law. He pretends to be an anti-war activist, only to make Western countries look bad. He says it's wrong for Western countries to violate international law, but then defends Russia when it violates international law. This is a great example of Russian exceptionalism.
Who, for some strange reason, are bitterly against quote-unquote American imperialism and idealistically for Soviet Marxist-Leninist imperialism.
Not just Ben, but so many other Kremlin propagandists and alt media claim to be anti-war, but really, they're just a bunch of wannabe Israeli settlers. Some user named Deny wrote on Twitter, "It's Ukraine one day, then show of soldiers bearing lethal force, it's Russia. That's invasion 101. Then Lee responded and said, "Do you know the history of Crimea?" Crimea was a Turkic state in the 1400s before it was a part of the Russian Empire. Does Erdogan have a right to take over Crimea? And if he did, you know damn well all these Kremlin shills would be campaigning against it.
Men då ska man... Nej, och då är judarnas motivering då till att det ska ligga där det ligger. Vi var här först. Ja, men det är ju 2000 år sedan! Hur jävla långsint får man bli? Ska vi vrida tillbaka allting 2000 år? Alltså fatta 3 jävligt glada indianer i Nordamerika. Bara, wey, fan vad mycket plats det blev.
Let's look at some of Ben's tweets. He says, "Anti-black racism reveals Israel's white supremacy. The Zionist movement was founded on white supremacy. The US and Israel, both are based on white supremacy." After Obama, America's first black president, signed over more welfare to Israel, Ben said that the unbreakable bond between the US and Israel is based on white supremacy. Who do you think pressured Obama to give Israel billions of dollars of aid? Was it the Israeli lobby? Or was it a random group of skinheads? Ben is the real racist. He takes what Israel is doing and uses it to incite hatred towards a group of people who are not responsible for it. In this case, white Americans. The KGB wants civil war in the US. They need to incite the minorities. There's so many Marxists simultaneously doing what Ben is doing, and as a result, there's been a drastic increase in hate crimes these past couple of years.
With cuts, bruises, and swelling all over his body, 50-year-old David Wilcox shared about being brutally attacked Wednesday afternoon on Chicago's West Side.
My body is badly hurting.
He says it all started out as a minor fender bender in the 1100 block of South Kedzie, but when he got out to approach the car he says sideswiped him.
I heard a lady yell something about, that guy's one of those Trump supporters. All hell broke loose.
Wilcox says 2 women and 3 men got out of their car and, as seen in the cell phone video, attacked him.
I was getting hit from all sides.
Initially, no one stepped in to help. Rather, onlookers chanted from the side.
Don't vote Trump! Don't vote Trump! That's when everything got really violent.
When suddenly one of the offenders hopped into the driver's seat, dragging Wilcox several blocks.
I don't like Trump either, but he's clearly not a white supremacist. These communist agents need to be held accountable for all the chaos they've created. And they need to be investigated just like the Rosenbergs were. Online, you'll see comments saying, how can this person be a shill if they criticize Zionism? It's called controlled opposition. As you've seen earlier, Ben criticizes Israel so he can use it to increase hatred of the US. KGB director Yuri Andropov, who was Jewish, promoted criticism of Israel in Muslim countries. Why? Because he used it to increase hatred of the US, and this gave rise to Marxist-Leninism in Muslim countries. This is codenamed Operation SIG. 398 members of the House voted to violate the First Amendment and make it a punishable offense to boycott Israel, a foreign country. This is treason. Clearly, a vast majority of the Congress is not loyal to the US. They are loyal to Israel. Ben claims that it's the other way around, and that Israel is a loyal proxy of the US. He said, quote, "The notion that Israel controls the politics of the US empire is a ridiculous, right-wing, and actually anti-Semitic view." End quote. Ben is Putin's propagandist, and he is carrying out Yuri Andropov's strategy. Do you think this is just a coincidence? Or is he being paid to do so? While in the KGB, Putin was said to have kept a photograph of Andropov in his office, and even laid flowers on his grave. One of Putin's first acts when he became prime minister was to reinstate the plaque to Andropov on the former KGB headquarters building. He also had a 10-foot statue of Andropov erected in the town of Petrozavodsk. In 1999, when he was head of the KGB successor, the FSB, he asked the historian Roy Medvedev to give a lecture on the virtues of Andropov to hundreds of agents. Protesters shut down a Trump rally, and Ben said that Americans are standing up, saying no to the rise of fascism. Ben and many other Marxists are framing Trump as a fascist in order to radicalize the left.
Out square! Slash his throat! Every fucking Republican! Suck my fucking balls!
Say that one more time.
Slash Republican throats! Slash fascist throats! Death to fascism!
Have a good one!
Despite all of Antifa's violence, Ben often portrays them as heroes. He is one of the KGB's agent provocateurs, and he's rallying the left in America.
My ancestors enslaved those pieces of We're gonna win. I rule the world! Those pieces of get ruled by people like me! They look up and see a face like mine looking down at them!
As you've seen in my last documentary, Richard Spencer is also one of the KGB's agent provocateurs. What's he been doing the last couple of years? Rallying the right in America. KGB has its operatives on both sides of the spectrum manipulating the masses into fighting each other. Ever wondered why the alt-right is chanting, "Russia is our friend"? Meanwhile, Antifa is holding up signs saying, "Stop Russophobia"? Because I'm covering Putin's role in cultural Marxism, there will be trolls in the comment section again claiming that I'm taking the blame off of certain people. Who do you think created the KGB? These are Putin's heroes, and they're not exactly Russian. Lastly, Ben claims that Trump's administration is spearheaded by white supremacist Stephen Miller.
How are you with the Jews?
Are you okay?
The Jews?
Yeah.
I mean, the Jews are fine by me.
And so Jews can live in your neighborhood, then go to your cocktail party with all those good-looking people?
Look white to me.
Not trying to be a prophet, but he who parted the sea is a part of me. And when I look in my heart, I see the same mystery. And I know that we share the same history. Yeah, Hebrew is the language of G-D, so silently I know he walks with.
But the great expanse of science was deeply wedded to, historically speaking, the Judeo-Christian belief.
Freed up, so please plant your seeds up. Israel's the bride and the groom's inside. And when I'm staring at the line, I'm like open wide. And when I'm drowning in the ocean, I will choke the tide. Snatch a patch from the sky, put that patch in my eye. You can tell me I'm fly, but it's not for a white guy. Back when I rapped in high school, people told me that I'm tight for a white dude. What'd you tell them? I'm not white, I'm Jewish. I'm not white, I'm Jewish. Back when I rapped in high school, people told me that I'm tight for a white dude. What'd you tell them? I'm not white, I'm Jewish. I'm not white, I'm Jewish.
It's an honor to be here with the first Jewish president of the United States. And if he isn't, he should be.
Choose good health, low cholesterol and dental insurance. Choose fixed interest mortgage repayments. Choose a starter home. Choose your friends. Choose leisure wear and matching luggage. Choose a three-piece suite on hire purchase and a range of fucking fabrics. Choose DIY and wondering who the fuck you are on a Sunday morning. Choose sitting on that couch watching mind-numbing, spirit-crushing game shows, stuffing fucking junk food into your mouth.
Here comes Johnny.
But why would I want to do a thing like that?
He's gonna do the striptease.
Thanks to my Patreon supporters who decided to stay for some reason. And thanks to those who supported my last documentary. You know who you are. Yeah, some of you are wondering, why am I back? Well, normal life, that's not for me. I tried, but I can't do it. I'd actually rather continue playing this dangerous game. And whatever happens, happens.
I have come to talk about survival. It's a question of survival of this system. You may ask me, what is it in for me? Survival, obviously, because unlike, as I said, I am now in your boat. If we sing together, we'll sing beautifully together. There is no other place on this planet to defect to.
We fight! We fight and we fight and we fight and we shut down our workplaces, we shut down our schools, we shut down the streets, we shut down business as usual.
In the second episode of Putin's Marxists, we'll be investigating popular anti-war activist Mike Preisner. But first we need to take a look at Phil Giraldi and ideological subversion. Phil is a former CIA operations officer and current Russian intelligence asset. I used to be a big fan of Phil, but now me and a few others online find it suspicious that he covers the technology transfers from Israel to China, meanwhile refusing to address the technology transfers between Israel and Russia. I'll show you what I mean. Back in January, after Iran's missile defense system shot down a Ukrainian airliner, Phil blamed the US and claimed that the Ukrainian transponder and Iranian missile defense system were most likely hacked by the US and Israel. I agree that it was most likely hacked, and if so, Israel was definitely involved. But what Phil won't tell you is that Russia and Israel contracted a deal several years ago where Israel provided Russia with codes for UAVs it sold to Georgia in exchange for Iranian aerial defense system codes. According to the leaked 2009 document, Russia gave Israel the codes for the Tor M1 missile defense system that it sold to Iran. Over 10 years later, Iran confirmed that 2 of its missiles were fired at the downed Ukrainian airliner. Those missiles came from the Tor M1, which Russia sold to Iran. Russia also traded the Tor M1 system codes to Israel, which is how they got inside and operated it. So the blame for the hacking should fall upon Russia and Soviet Israel. I'm not saying that the US is innocent in its approach to Iran, But it's pretty clear that Phil is covering up for his employers here. I'll show you what I mean. Phil criticizes members of Congress for treason because they are working for Israeli interests, and he often brings up FARA, the Foreign Agents Registration Act of 1938, which requires individuals acting on behalf of a foreign country to register with the Justice Department and to reveal their sources of funds. I agree with Phil here, but when the Justice Department demanded that RT and Sputnik register as foreign agents, he completely flip-flopped and demonized the Foreign Agents Registration Act as a violation of the First Amendment. He wrote an article titled, "Sputnik and Russia Today Under Investigation by U.S. Department of Justice. Is it news or propaganda? And what about the First Amendment?" Quote, "Somehow everything keeps coming back around to Russia. In one of its recent initiatives, the Justice Department appears to be attacking the First Amendment as part of the apparent bipartisan program to make Vladimir Putin the fall guy for everything that goes wrong in Washington. In the past month, the DOJ has revealed that the FBI is investigating Russian-owned news outlets Sputnik News and RT International and has sent letters to the latter demanding that one of its business affiliates register as a foreign agent by October 17th. Phil is an enormous hypocrite. He criticizes Israeli operatives for treason as they refuse to register as foreign agents. Meanwhile, he doesn't want Russian operatives to register as foreign agents. Under Phil's own logic, he is guilty of treason. RT and Sputnik are still allowed to operate in the US, but because they are funded by the Russian government, they have to register as foreign agents. Phil claiming that FARA is all of a sudden an attack on the First Amendment is one of the most outrageous things I've ever seen in my life. What's worse is that he uses the same bullshit excuse as the Zionists he vehemently opposes. AIPAC lobbyist Lenny Ben-David wrote an article on the Jerusalem Post titled, "Washington's Elders of Anti-Zion." He said, as the 6,500 AIPAC conference attendees leave Capitol Hill and head back to their homes this week, they should be proud of their efforts. That's what we mean by free speech in this country. I say it will be a sad day for this country when its citizens stop using the precious guarantees in the First Amendment to petition their government. So I say there's nothing new about lobbying on behalf of causes in foreign places. Phil is defending RT, which is formerly known as Soviet Russia Today. It has been a propaganda outlet for the Kremlin for much of the past 100 years. He said, "One keeps reading or hearing how the American government has indisputable proof of Moscow's intentions to subvert democracy in the US as well as in Europe, but the actual evidence is still elusive. In case some of you believe the garbage that he spews, I'm going to prove that Russia is ideologically subverting the US and Europe." Soviet propagandist Rania Khalek said, "Israel is European white supremacy in its most traditional settler colonial form." Soviet propagandist Mike Preisner said, "White Europeans can immigrate to their homeland in the Middle East to kill, rob, and subjugate the indigenous people with impunity, Israel." These Soviet propagandists are taking Israel's crimes in the region, then framing it as an extension of European colonialism in order to demonize the West. This has always been a goal for the communists. The fact is, Israel was built by Jewish Bolsheviks from the Soviet Union with a long history of violence. Israel's founding Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion, created Mapai, the Workers' Party of the Land of Israel, in 1930, and that party ruled Israel until 1969. Take a look at their logo. What does that remind you of? Leahy, also known as the Stern Gang, which went around ethnically cleansing Arabs, well, they were Nazbols. The Soviet propagandists are lying to you, claiming that white Europeans are going around murdering Arabs. These so-called anti-Zionists who work with RT are actually covering up one of the most damaging revelations for Russia and Israel. Many of Israel's early inhabitants were Russian-born. They spoke Russian, read books and sang songs in Russian, and thought and dreamed in Russian. Many of them owed their lives to the Red Army's war against Nazi Germany. Stalin was considered the father of the victory over Hitler. Fast forward to today, Russian Jews still have a strong influence in Israel. Yair Netanyahu basically admitted that they are responsible for keeping his dad in power. Quote, Most of my friends are Israelis born in Russia. The immigration from the Soviet Union is among the magnificent assets that have been here. Immigration that brought many intellectuals, Zionists, and patriots to Israel. An absolute majority of USSR immigrants are members of the national camp, and most of them vote Likud. The Likud is the natural home of Israelis from the USSR. Soviet propagandist Patrick Henningsen said, "Actually, you have it backwards. Israel is made up of mostly white European settlers who invaded Palestine." Soviet propagandist Eva Bartlett said, "Fucking white colonial settler state of so-called Israel murdering Palestinians in media blackout as per status quo." Soviet propagandist Ben Norton said, "Gal Gadot is white, and Israel, just like its imperial sponsor, the US, is a white supremacist apartheid state." KGB director Yuri Andropov, who was Jewish, promoted criticism of Israel to Muslim countries. Why? Because he did so in a way where he could increase hatred for the US. Basically, he threw Israel under the bus to further Marxist-Leninism in Muslim countries. This is known as Operation SIG. Fast forward to today. Soviet propagandists criticize Israel, but they do so in a way where they can increase hatred for Europeans and further cultural Marxism in the West. So Phil is obviously lying when he says there's no proof that Russia is subverting the US and Europe. Now let's take a look at Global Research, the site where he posts many of his articles. It is run by Michael Kosudovsky and was accused by NATO information warfare specialists of playing a key role in the spread of pro-Russian propaganda. Kosudovsky, who runs this popular anti-Zionist website, is of Russian Jewish origin. And he also uses Israel to smear the West. Global Research constantly demonizes the West while simultaneously promoting Russia and China. This is textbook communist propaganda. While Phil is denying that Russia is subverting the US and Europe, his buddy Alexander Dugin, who works with GRU, Russian military intelligence, openly admits that Russia is subverting the West. Dugin wrote an article on 4pt.su titled, "The Principles and Strategy of Coming War." He said, "You mustn't demonize the enemy at the very beginning of the war. The image of the enemy must be formed in advance and deliberately. Therefore, the first task to gain victory would be real fully fledged company to create the entirely negative monstrous satanic image of the United States and the West in general. Therefore, the West is a place where the devil resides. It is the center of the global capitalist tentacles. It is the matrix of rotting cultural perversion and a vice grip of falsehood and cynicism, violence and hypocrisy. Russia already does this." Phil doubles down and writes another article claiming that Russia is not subverting America. He said, "If anyone is looking for Russiagate 2, this is exactly how it begins. Blame China, and if that does not seem to be working, look for the perfidious hand of Vladimir Putin, who clearly spends all day in his office dreaming up schemes whereby providing medical supplies to the US and Europe is all part of some master plan to subvert the 2020 presidential election." Not necessarily to subvert the 2020 election, but after Russia provided Italy with coronavirus aid, they did in fact use their propagandists to promote Italy moving away from the EU and closer towards the Eurasian bloc. Sarah Abdullah, who is a passionate Soviet propagandist, tweeted, "From Russia with love. Watch the Russian military answer Italy's call by transporting truckloads of medical equipment to the country worst hit by coronavirus in all of Europe. Meanwhile, the EU, NATO, and the US are nowhere to be found." Clearly, this was a publicity stunt. Russia does not care about the well-being of Italy. Italy detained 23 Russian sailors for trafficking migrants into their country. I showed in one of my last videos that these human traffickers are working for Russian intelligence. After they push migrants into Europe and the chaos unfolds, Dugin steps in and says Russians can save Europe from the liberal elite. He takes advantage of the right-wing sentiment and uses it to push Italy closer towards the Eurasian bloc. There's another example of Phil's buddy subverting the West. So Dugin works with GRU, Russian military intelligence, and Phil runs PR for GRU. He wrote an article on Russian Insider titled, "The US indictment of 12 Russian intel officers is a ludicrous fraud, pure political theater." Phil defends Russian spies as shamelessly as Zionists defend Israeli spies. In 2014, the ADL said that the US's refusal to release Pollard borders on anti-Semitism. Yes, Phil does a good job covering Israeli espionage, but the Soviets use him to cover up Russian espionage. This is an example of how controlled opposition works. For someone like Phil, who has worked extensively in US intelligence, to come out and say that Russia is not subverting America is astonishing. Ask yourself, is Phil retarded or is he lying to you? He's not retarded. And what's funny is that while Phil was in the CIA, the KGB was accusing them of creating AIDS as a biological weapon to use against Africans. Let's take a look at one of their articles. The first paragraph reads, "A prominent physician has charged that the spread of AIDS epidemic in some parts of Africa is due largely to bacteriological and chemical experiments conducted over the years in these areas by the US Central Intelligence Agency." In case some of you think I'm pushing fake news, let's take a look at some of AfriSynergy News' videos on YouTube. America's experimentation, the chimpanzees, hepatitis B, precursor of grids, and HIV/AIDS. Pale-skinned females almost immune to HIV/AIDS. US manufactured HIV/AIDS. Bioweapon 1 HIV and Bioweapon 2 COVID-19, blacks' primary target in US. T. West of AfriSynergy News is a devout Soviet propagandist. Russia is still paying people to promote conspiracy theories that the US created AIDS to genocide black people. Phil's buddy again openly admits that this is their strategy. Dugin wrote in Foundations of Geopolitics that the Russian special services should promote all forms of instability and separatism within the borders of the United States and make use of the political forces of Afro-American racists. Here's another one of his videos titled, "Repeatedly, it's pale-skinned cops terrorizing and brutalizing blacks in America." Let's look at some of the comments from his videos. "The whole crack epidemic on black folks was chemical warfare orchestrated by our own government. Our lives have no value whatsoever in America KKK. This is why we must form a self-defense agency, i.e. a paramilitary outfit. This is exactly what Russia wants. What we're seeing here is known as active measures, a tactic where the Soviets used the media to promote disinformation intended to fracture the society of their enemy country. In this scenario, they are shaping the minds of African Americans into believing that their own government is trying to genocide them using crack, AIDS, and the police. Unfortunately, a lot of blacks and white leftists believe this. The Soviets want Americans fighting with each other, so they fund black agent provocateurs as well as white agent provocateurs.
Okay, joining us live from Los Angeles for more on the issue is anti-war activist and Iraq veteran Michael Preisner. Thank you indeed for joining us. Why are the police getting away with exercising a shoot-to-kill policy on suspects instead of trying to take them alive? Isn't it tantamount really to execution without trial that?
That's absolutely what this is. Cops being judge, jury, and executioner in so many cases around the country where a popular study has found that every 28 hours an African American is killed by law enforcement in the United States. That's a staggering number. Racism and white supremacy, of course, plays so much into that because that's why these white officers can kill black people on a massive, massive scale and are never punished for it. And as soon as the incident happens, the entire system rallies around the defense of the police officer and demonizes the victim. That's what we saw with the Michael Brown case.
Okay. Together with that, there is another process.
law enforcement, law and order organization and structure is being eroded. For the last 20, 25 years, if you see old movies and new movies, you can see that in new movies, a policeman, an officer of the United States Army looks dumb, angry, psychotic, paranoid. A criminal looks nice, kind of, well, he smokes hash and shoots the whatever drug, but basically he's a nice human being. He's creative. And he's unproductive only because society oppresses him. Whereby a general of Pentagon is always, by definition, a dumb, a war maniac. A policeman is a pig, rude policeman. He abuses his power. You know? A generality, generalization like that. The hatred, the mistrust to the people who are supposed to protect you and enforce law and order.
I've seen footage of some police officers taking things too far, but Marxists have used that to turn this entirely into a race issue, which it is not. This police brutality psyop was one of the greatest accomplishments for the Soviets. They used it to increase hostility, violence, and distrust in American society. Not to mention furthering Marxism all over the West. Russian intelligence used its trolls to incite racial tensions all over Facebook and Instagram. Russian government propagandists and alt media were used to promote this psyop. RT also promoted this psyop. And the people who own CNN were in on it as well. I'll let you figure that one out yourself. Some of you might remember Mike Preisner as the guy who gave an amazing anti-war speech several years ago. I used to be a fan of him, but looking into him further, I realized that he's not actually anti-war. He supports ethnic cleansing and illegal occupation when it's done by the Soviet Union and Russia. He claims that the Soviet Union liberated Crimea after it defeated Germany. After the Soviets recaptured Crimea, Stalin expelled hundreds of thousands of Crimean Tatars to Central Asia. Many of them died in the process by starvation and disease. To call this liberation is an insult to the memory of hundreds of thousands of Crimean Tatars. Preisner is always raving on about racism, but then he celebrates Stalin collectively punishing an entire group of people based on their ethnicity. These cultural Marxists constantly bring up past atrocities of Western countries in order to manipulate leftists into hating their own nation. Meanwhile, these same hypocrites whitewash the Soviet Union's genocides. Preisner regularly criticizes Israel for illegally occupying Palestine and brings up the UN. I agree with him here, but then he defends Russia's annexation of Crimea, which the UN also admits is illegal under international law. He condemned the EU for sanctioning Russia and downplayed Russia's invasion as, quote, behavior in Ukraine. So he wants all countries to honor UN human rights laws except for Russia. This is further proof that he's not actually anti-war. He supports ethnic cleansing and illegal occupation when it's done by the Soviet Union and Russia. He is a mouthpiece for Putin. A lot of the Ukrainian population are nationalists, and Putin used that to smear them as Nazis to justify his invasion. Even Jewish publications admit that Putin has his own army of Jews, which he uses to smear his political opponents as Nazis. And they are not necessarily aligned with the Zionist movement. They are more aligned with the communist movement. Here's a great example. This article is from the South African Jewish Report titled, Joe Slovo, Anti-Zionist Universalist Who Fought for a Just Cause. Slovo was employed by the Russians in the 1970s when he had been in exile from South Africa to go from town to town in Lithuania to try to convince the people who all oppose the Russian occupation that they should be supportive of Russia and be good communists. This is what Preisner is doing today. He shared an article from RT and said, Victorious protesters in Ukraine celebrate by destroying memorials to soldiers who died liberating them from Nazi rule. He's painting Soviet soldiers as liberators of Ukraine. This is the most offensive thing you could ever say to Ukrainians. The Soviets starved to death millions of Ukrainians. Parents had to watch their children die slowly. Others were sent to slave labor camps, and they were not allowed to practice their religion in a time of such terror. Calling this liberation is 100% communist propaganda. Once again, Preiser and Putin are pushing the same propaganda. Quote, "It is people like those who negotiated with Hitler. It is people like that who today are tearing down monuments to the liberating warriors, the Red Army soldiers who freed Europe, and the European people from the Nazis." Putin is constantly smearing his political opponents as Nazi collaborators. Has it ever crossed his mind that maybe Eastern Europeans decided to work with Germany because of how brutal the Soviets were? Award-winning Russian historian Konstantin Pleshakov wrote in his book Stalin's Folly, quote, "Some villagers, though, offered the invaders an egg and a piece of dry bread as a welcome, and women came out of their houses with icons held to their chests crying, 'We are still Christians, free us from Stalin who destroyed our churches.'" Churches could indeed open now. Candles were burning again and people were praying in front of the shimmering icons. Some churches were so packed that there was not a corner left in the cathedral in which people were not standing, sitting, or kneeling. Also, there was little hope for guerrilla warfare in western Ukraine and the Baltics, where many people had greeted the Germans as liberators. Even if they hadn't, they were still unwilling to assist the Soviets, who didn't look any better to them than the Nazis. Remember in episode 1 where Ben Norton claimed that Israel is a loyal proxy of the US and the notion that Israel controls the politics of the US empire is a ridiculous right-wing and anti-Semitic view? Anyone who has actually researched this issue knows that the US political system is dominated by the Israeli lobby. This next clip further proves that Russia's anti-Zionist movement is controlled opposition.
Sure. Well, I have no real interest in dabbling into the anti-Semitism or kind of misconstrued ideas about what's causing the foreign policy or the economic crisis here in the United States. It's not the Israeli lobby. The Israeli lobby is powerful, but it is empowered by the U.S. government and by the U.S. system because it serves a purpose. Things in the United States are going to stay the same regardless of it's Obama or Romney that is elected. It's going to stay on the same course in the Middle East and its war drive towards other countries in the rest of the world because the system is dominated by the banks in this country, by the giant corporations and shareholders in this country who have at their disposal the entire U.S. political system, the entire media system, the entire military system, all of the arms of the state. All of these things serve the interests of not even the 1%, but that 0.1%. And that's just the fundamental aspect of the system we live under, the U.S. capitalist system. So the reality is, whether it's Obama or Romney that wins the election, it's the big banks and corporations that ultimately win. That's not going to change unless the people of this country rise up and overthrow that system altogether.
Preisner doesn't want Americans to fix the political system dominated by the Israeli lobby. Instead, he wants them to rise up and overthrow the US capitalist system. He wants a communist revolution.
And we've shut down our workplaces, we've shut down our schools, we've shut down the streets.
If Preisner was genuinely anti-war, he wouldn't try to shut down criticism of the Israeli lobby, which openly promotes war after war. He uses his anti-war position to subvert and try to shut down US industries, which would greatly benefit Russia. It's not just the Soviet propagandists on the left, but the Nazbols on the right have also been complaining about capitalism non-stop these past few months. Slavoj Zizek wrote an article titled, "Alt-right Trump supporters and left-wing Bernie Sanders fans should join together and defeat capitalism." Then Richard Spencer responded, "I'm in." White Bolshevism said, It's easy to preach against Marxism and communism, but when it comes to the modern political environment, it makes more sense to remain critical in a revolutionary way against democracy, capitalism, and Americanism. Keith Wood said, "I find it increasingly hard to take someone seriously if they call themselves a nationalist and are not highly critical of capitalism." Yes, there are legitimate criticisms of capitalism, but at the same time, these Duganists are defending communism. I'll show you what I mean.
Let's back up a moment. How did cultural Marxism get into the United States? Some brief history. In 1923, members of the Marxist Communist Party set up an institute at Frankfurt University in Germany. This institute was named the Institute for Social Research. Later, it would become known as simply the Frankfurt School. These new Marxists, under the direction of Max Horkheimer, had seen the old Lenin Marxists fail. The workers of the world did not unite in World War I. Further, they realized why. Antonio Gramsci, the disciple who wrote the prison notebooks, had it right. Marxism could only flourish after a long march through the cultural institutions. Now, the mantra would be, change Western culture, and then the workers will unite.
Some of the intellectuals who set up the Frankfurt School and subverted Western culture were members of the Communist Party, which is Soviet intelligence. To this day, Russian intelligence is still trying to ideologically subvert the West. Now let's look at what Keith has to say about this. Quote, "I bet the same people complaining about intellectualizing on the right also think that a handful of Jewish academics subverted the West by inventing cultural Marxism." So Keith is basically claiming that Jewish academics did not subvert the West and promote far-left ideas such as open borders, LGBT, feminism, and hatred for your own country. Keith is well aware of the JQ, so why is he downplaying this? Well, white Bolshevism provides some clarity. Quote, "Cultural Marxism is a false meme. How much power did these intellectuals and academics have compared to the corporations? Cultural capitalism is the accurate way of describing the fact that the bourgeoisie won and are revolutionizing society." So basically, these Duganists are trying to cover up the KGB's cultural Marxism. They're claiming that communists did not ideologically subvert the West, and all this liberalism we see today is just a byproduct of capitalism. Richard Spencer, who is the most obvious shell for Russia, is also trying to cover up the KGB's cultural Marxism. Quote, "Do we really believe that Horkheimer and Adorno had this much influence? This cultural Marxism meme is really overdone." I'm sure some of you noticed that these Nazbols have also been shilling relentlessly for China these past few months. Here's a tweet from Matt Parrott which clarifies the agenda. If you don't remember who Matt Parrott is, he's the guy who stood on a box watching his wife have sex with Matt Heimbach. He said, "China has handled this epidemic exceedingly well, and regardless of the final numbers, this incident has been a landmark moment in the rise of China and decline of the West. Stop being loyal to the West. The West hates you and wants you dead." I'm not endorsing everything that Trump and Kushner are doing, but it's an undeniable fact that China lied and allowed the virus to spread, which ended up crashing the world economy. To say that China handled this epidemic exceedingly well is clearly propaganda. Let's take a look at a statement from the World Health Organization on January 10th. Who does not recommend any specific health measures for travelers to and from Wuhan, China? It is generally considered that entry screening offers little benefit while requiring considerable resources. WHO, which covered this up, is run by Tedros Adhanom. He was a part of the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, and they were If the West doesn't recover well from this, while Russia and China do, that's definitely a cause for concern, and it's something to keep an eye out for. The last thing I wanted to point out is that the Kremlin-funded media in Russia and on YouTube is claiming that the coronavirus is a US bioweapon, just like they did with AIDS. If someone actually provided evidence, I would consider it, but none of these people are doing that. Let's take a look at the last Soviet vagabond. He's constantly claiming that the coronavirus broke out in the US and not China. It sounds interesting, but he's actually a con artist. He considers himself an anti-war activist, and he's always raving on about Western imperialism. Meanwhile, he defends Russian imperialism. He said, "Stop saying Putin invaded Ukraine and annexed Crimea."
We criticize a lot American presence in foreign countries, but we never criticize and we never pay too much attention about these planes landing with ammunition and firearms in, say, countries like Ethiopia. These are the pictures in Time magazine which probably you've seen and then forgotten about it. These are the Soviet tanks on foreign territory. Are there any protest demonstrations in Los Angeles or New York City? No. These are the Soviet military advisors. Nobody tells them Russians go home. How it starts, the media obviously plays a great role.
When the DOJ ordered RT to register as a foreign agent, he reposted an article on his website defending RT, just like Phil did. The last Soviet vagabond constantly demonizes the West, while simultaneously defending Russia and China at every opportunity. And in most of his videos, he sources global research. So it's pretty obvious what their agenda is. This looks like another case of Operation SIG. Because the mainstream media criticizes Russia, a lot of people online believe that Israel is against Russia. I've proven many times that this is a false dialectic. Now that the mainstream media is criticizing China, a lot of people online believe that Israel is against China. This is completely retarded. China needs Israel for its Belt and Road Initiative to secure European, African, and Middle Eastern markets. Basically, China needs Israel to become the leading economic power, which is why they invest billions of dollars in Israel every year. China is on pace to overtake the US as the biggest investor in Israel. Bibi has even said that Israel and China are a match made in heaven. Yes, China may not be happy that the US will now be buying most of its drugs from Israel instead of China, but they will not turn against Israel for this. They have not criticized Israel once during this entire conflict. Why? Because they need Israel for their Belt and Road Initiative, and they don't want Israel to stop selling them US technology.